Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend some time talking about fears and monsters. That'll become more clear as we work our way through this, because the title of the book is Befriending Your Monsters, Facing the Darkness of Your Fears to Experience the Light. It is published by Baker Books. It came out just a couple of weeks ago, so you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but you know what we always do. We provide an opportunity for you to get a copy of it if you want to go to our website and get it either in paperback or Kindle. We also have a connection to our author, Luke Norsworthy, because not only is he the author of this book, he has a great podcast that you might want to know more about. A graduate of Abilene Christian University, senior pastor of the 1,500-member Westover Hills Church of Christ in Austin, Texas. Also, of course, the host of the Newsworthy with Norsworthy podcast, an individual that interviews some of the same people we interview here on Point of View. So, Luke, just great to have you on the program with us today.
Well, I'm very honored that you would take the time to talk with me. So it is my pleasure.
You know, I was just thinking, when you wrote this book about fear, you probably weren't thinking of the fear that people would have about getting a disease during a pandemic and being sick or even dying. You probably weren't thinking about the fears people might have during protests and riots. But I just couldn't help but think that how appropriate your book is given where we find ourselves here in this year.
Well, you're obviously correct. When I wrote this book, I didn't have any foreknowledge about what was going to be transpiring right now. But obviously, what we do see is there's a lot of fears that are played out in multiple different fronts. And, the fears that I talk about in the book are real fears that our monsters become, in some ways placeholders for them, because monsters are fake, but our fake monsters represent the real fears that we have. And if there's anything that is in abundance right now, it is, like you said, fear.
And again, we're going to talk about a little bit later these universal monsters of comparison and more and success. But I thought before we get there, let's talk about this, because you use this idea of monsters and having children who had to sleep on the floor before you had a night light and all sorts of other things, or all of us wondering about werewolves and things of that nature. As you said, monsters aren't real, but fears are, and sometimes they come to us almost like those monsters of our childhood, don't they?
Yeah. Sometimes they just show up in ways that, we don't want to deal with them. Because when you're a kid and you hear a sound in the back of your closet when you're trying to go to sleep all alone in your room, there's two responses. The first response is you're going to hide underneath the covers, pretend like you didn't hear it, hope that it's going to go away. And the second option is you get up, you grab a lightsaber, you stuff a pillow underneath your shirt, and you go to the closet and you're going to face that monster, whatever it is. You're going to look at it, you're going to get a flashlight and inspect and find it. And when we get older, the idea of hiding underneath our bed gets more mature, and now it looks like being obsessed with our work, living vicariously through our kids, abusing chocolate or alcohol or social media or whatever. Yes. But we're all doing the same thing. We're hiding from them. And so you got two options. You can either run from them or you can face your monsters. And here's the thing about monsters. They get you to go where you don't want to go, because when you go where you don't want to go, only then and in that place can you become everything you're created to be. And I think that's how God works in the process.
I just think it's wonderful. And again, I love the monstrous metaphor that you talk about. But let's go back to your position for just a minute as the senior pastor in an outstanding church there in Austin. And that is,
Yes,
when your church has people fill out prayer cards, I love what you say. There's one theme that runs through them all: fear of finances, fear of the future, fear of not being enough, fear of not having enough, fear for my kids' well-being, fear of never being able to move on from the past. It is amazing if you understand that is such a motivator in the negative, sometimes in the positive sense too. Fear so dominates our lives that we almost don't realize how much we are motivated by fear, do we?
I completely agree. And like you said, I mean, when we do the prayer, the people exercise, that's what we call that prayer card exercise. They come in and I'll get a stack of them, and I will do my best every time we get them to read through them. And what you find is, fear that, I'm not going to be able to take care of myself in retirement. I'm not going to be able to, I don't know what to do with my kids. I don't know what I'm going to do about, my own work situation. And fear is all around us. But like you said, sometimes, fear helps. Like when you are in the forest and you hear a sound and you think it's like a bear or a snake that's coming for you, fear helps you because it gets you moving. It gets you to run. The problem is when fear moves into the driver's seat, when it doesn't serve as an aid, because there are times you need to be afraid. Obviously, that's how you survive. But when it comes to your day in and day out, normal resting kind of existence, if fear is always driving that, then it's taken over you. And I think as much as I want to say fear can be something that's positive, that you need to befriend your fear and your monsters, we would be naive if we think fear can only be a good thing for us. Because I think there's a pull that all of our fears have on us that pulls us away from our Creator and our God's best intention for us.
Yes.
Yeah, and they can get us away from that. And when you let fear be unchecked, it pulls you farther and farther away from what Jesus came to give us.
Again, let's, if we can, maybe focus on the 3 Ds: dark, destroy, and deliver. Then, of course, a little bit later, we'll get into the universal monsters, which I want to save a little bit later. But one of those is the idea of into the dark. Darkness sometimes can be helpful in the sense that, as you sort of talk about, you lean into the dark, you experience it. You, in some respects, need to overcome that. You don't need to be like your, a 15-month-old that slept on the floor and got hit in the head. By the way, my kids did that too, so I guess it's not just you, it's universal, because they were scared, and then once you put in a nightlight, they weren't. But sometimes leaning into the dark is a good idea, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you have to go where you don't want to go so you can become everything you're created to be. And the darkness, at least the way I use the metaphor, I'm not really referring to how bright your room is. I'm referring to the places that, your bright personality, your bright accomplishments, your idealistic pictures that you post on social media. I'm referring to that as like the antithesis of what the darkness is. The darkness is where all your best techniques and tricks for making you feel better about yourself than you really deserve, when those don't work, that's the darkness. When all of a sudden I can't tell a joke, I can't be successful enough, I can't do anything but take a real honest look at who I am, what I've become, where I'm going, and what I have created of a mess that I'm in. And so I think when you go into those places of vulnerability, I think that's where you meet God, because God doesn't care about the external idealized picture that we put out. God looks at the heart. And so I think that's where we meet God. And that's why you have to go to the dark, because that's where God wants to find us.
Yeah. And again, I think we all learn more from our failures than our successes. We learn more sometimes in the dark places than we do in the places of light and where we have fame and success, which, of course, sets us up for some of the things we're going to talk about after the break. This is just a fascinating book, Befriending Your Monsters, Facing the Darkness of Your Fears to Experience the Light. We'll come back and talk about a couple of those other Ds real quickly: destroy and deliver. Then we'll get into these universal monsters, which all of us face, and how to address those from a biblical point of view. So lots to cover. Luke Norsworthy with us, and we'll continue our conversation with him right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Whenever this country has faced a national emergency, our political leaders have increased their power and authority. More power flows to the national government, and usually more power flows from Congress to the executive branch. President Roosevelt expanded the federal government during the Great Depression with his New Deal programs. President Bush created huge agencies, the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, after the attack on 9/11. The exception has been the response from the Trump administration during this pandemic. Although the president's critics have often accused him of being a dictator, some would have to admit that they were surprised that he has encouraged governors to make more of the decisions while clearing away federal regulations that may have prevented a more effective response. So far, federal agencies and departments have taken more than 600 regulatory actions. These were proposed as temporary actions of deregulation, but President Trump signed an executive order last month directing these agencies to review the actions and determine which, if any, would promote economic recovery if made permanent. Truck drivers that are hauling emergency supplies have been given more flexibility about their hours. Seniors have been allowed to consult with their doctors using FaceTime or other forms of telemedicine. Colleges have been allowed to ramp up their distance learning without governmental red tape. The Trump administration seems intent on keeping this coronavirus crisis from expanding the federal government. And if these new ventures in telemedicine and offline education are working, why should they stop when the crisis is over? Why shouldn't these temporary waivers be made permanent? What usually follows national emergencies is more power consolidated in the federal government. The Trump administration seems to be breaking that typical pattern in American history. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, continue our conversation with Luke Norsworthy. And again, the book is entitled Befriending Your Monsters. It is published by our friends at Baker. And we'll get into these three universal monsters in just a minute, which, of course, are very important. The idea of comparison, more, the idea that I need more, and success. But just before we do so, one of the other chapters is talking about destroy. And if nothing else, you start the chapter by talking about the so-called Milgram experiment. I don't think we've talked about this on this program in probably decades, but it's a good illustration, if nothing else, of the sinfulness of human individuals, human depravity, and how sometimes if we don't have empathy, we can bring a great deal of harm to others. Can you kind of break that down for us?
Yeah, well, clearly my father is a psychologist. That's why I have to put in somewhat antiquated psychological studies into my book, even though I'm a pastor.
I'm glad you did. Yeah. Well, so the study comes out. In some ways, it's post Holocaust, in which the question was being asked: if you get put in a terrible situation, what kind of things would you do? And if anyone has heard of kind of the somewhat infamous Eichmann in Jerusalem trial, where the conclusion was in what's described as like the banality of evil, that you want it to seem like this person who did awful, atrocious things is this hideous monster, but he just seems kind of like your normal mid-level kind of manager trying to aspire for a little bit more of success. And so what happened is you had, in the States, some psychologists who are trying to take this information and go, is this really true?
And so what you did, there's actually probably like 2 studies that kind of conclude this, including the Stanford prison study. But both of these studies put people in situations in which they are given the opportunity to follow the rules and hurt people, but they're simply following the rules, so they don't feel like a monster. So the study from that Milgram led up at Yale, where you have people go into this room and they're paired up with someone that they don't realize is an actor. And they're told, we want you to continue to shock this person whenever they give a wrong answer. And they don't realize the other person's not really getting shocked. They don't realize the other person who they think is even getting shocked is really an actor. They don't understand all that's going on. All they're testing really is how high of the voltage will you go with shocking the other person. And what was found is people would do terrible things, even if they thought the other person was unconscious or possibly no longer even living. And so the conclusion is what was called the Lucifer effect, where you put people in the wrong situation and they can do the wrong thing. Now, as Christians, the language that we would use is a little bit different, but it's the idea that there is something depraved in each and every one of us, and none of us is totally good. And so if we tie it back to the idea of monsters, the real fear of a werewolf isn't so much that, like, out in the forest, there's something that's going to turn into a werewolf that's going to come get us. But the real fear is that within us, in the wrong circumstances, in the wrong time, in the wrong place, we become the wrong kind of person. And so that's what I'm referring to as this negative side of the monsters, is that we all have the propensity to do these terrible things.
And again, I think that's helpful because some people might, as we get into these 3 universal monsters, say, oh, yeah, I know people that have a problem with comparison, but I don't. I know some people that are really materialistic, but I'm not. I know some people that are just success-driven, but I'm not. But if nothing else, what I think it does is sort of level the ground. And, of course, the ground is level at the foot of the cross. And so let's get into these universal monsters, because the first one you really want to help us address is this whole idea of comparison. And I would have to say that if you are talking to teenagers, that's a really big issue. But even more so now with social media, wouldn't you agree that, as you just alluded to a few minutes ago, that when I see your Facebook post or whatever it might be, it could be Twitter posts or it could be Snapchat or it can be TikTok or whatever, I'm really seeing, if you will, the highlight reel, and I start comparing myself, even if I'm not necessarily that insecure. And that's why the reasons you wrote that chapter, isn't it?
I think you're spot on. I think social media has definitely perpetuated that. In the book Addicted, talking about the rise of technology, there's a line in which the author makes the argument that the reason that Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg acquired Instagram is because they know one thing in common, that both Facebook and Instagram realizes that people love to compare. And while in generations past, we would have to compare over long periods of time, and you would eventually share your pictures of your vacation with your friends, or eventually they'd come over and see what your house looked like. Now, with social media, we are comparing in real time. And so every day we see, oh, you posted something about your kids or your grandkids, and how many likes and how many comments did you get based on that compared to someone else who posts the same thing. And so we're always comparing. And the monster of comparison is this, it's this real common situation that I think everyone has, whether you're a little kid and you're on the playground trying to see who's the fastest, or you get older and you try to figure out, oh, who gets to go on the nicest vacations, or who has the most picture-perfect family who gets together for Thanksgiving. It's just in all of us.
And again, one of the things you talk about is how to kind of break that down. And maybe for just a minute, since you're a pastor, let's talk about this, because you have other fellow pastors listening to this broadcast. You have elders, deacons, Bible teachers, Bible fellowship teachers. You have a whole section when you talk about that, the prop, the pull, the point, and the light. It does seem to me that the way you teach this is the way that I no doubt probably had the way you preached it in your church, and the way if somebody wanted to use this as a way to maybe begin to focus on this as a Bible study, it would be really a good kind of breakdown. So talk about how each one of the chapters has kind of subpoints underneath them so that you can actually teach that more effectively.
Well, like you said, my bread is buttered by my day job as a pastor. And so, everything is kind of filtered through that for me. And so for all your listeners, which I assume are all astute listeners who've heard the story of Jonah, that might be a great way to kind of introduce these ideas, and then we can flesh them out with the specific monsters.
Sure, because you have that. That's good. Yeah.
But the story of Jonah, which you have this prophet who gets swallowed by this large creature in the ocean, which the Bible may not say, but we all know is a whale. I always taught that in Sunday school, so it has to be true. And so Jonah gets swallowed by this whale, and it'd be easy to think that the monster in the story of Jonah is about that whale that swallows him. But your astute listeners already know this. They realize that the most monstrous thing that swallowed Jonah was not that whale, but it was the hatred that swallowed his heart, and the hatred for the Ninevites, this wicked town that did terrible things to his people, and he hated them. And so the pull of his hatred is that it made his heart so far away from the heart of God. God's heart was actually for Jonah's worst enemies. And the pull of the Ninevites is that his heart became so full of hatred that it was far from God. But the point of the monster in his life, it wasn't the whale, it was about the hatred. And the point is that he was given an invitation by God to let his heart become conformed to God's heart. Now, unfortunately, the story of Jonah doesn't end very well, because 3 times in chapter 4, he says, you know what? I would rather be dead than love these people. I'd rather be dead than to celebrate them receiving the boundless love of God. And so the light never really got in, but that was the opportunity for him. So in the same way, most of the time when we find ourselves comparing to someone else, the actual person that we're looking at and going, are they a little better than me or not? It's not about them. It never was about them. If you move to a different town, a different place, it's going to be a different person, because the issue is not about that unique person. Okay? And so they're just the prop in the story. And the actual pull is that what happens when we find ourselves comparing ourselves to someone else is that we are pulled onto this sliding scale with our identity. And our identity is this restless reality, because when you're comparing, you're always looking at someone who's better or worse than you. It's like the story of Saul. At the end of his life, there's this song that gets sung about him and the guy who's going to take over for him. And the song goes, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his tens of thousands.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not in the military. I've never killed anyone. But if I was, I would assume killing 1,000 people is a lot for a soldier to kill, right? That seems like it's a lot. Which, compared to the guy who was the American sniper, Chris Kyle, I think his count was 160 or 180. So I know as followers of Jesus, the numbers, that seems a little bit hard to compare and to think about in a positive sense maybe for some of us. But the idea is Saul had a great deal of success, but all of a sudden someone came along and was way better than him. So he became insecure because there was someone with just a little bit more than him. And that's what happens with comparison. We're either arrogant or depressed when it comes to comparison, because our identity is based on something that's not stable.
Yes.
And so the pull of comparison is that we lose our identity. We live with this restless inner workings. But the point is, with comparison,
the scale,
is that all along,
and need to take a break. But again, the stable scale, and then of course the light is your lane. But we need to finish that after the break. So, again, I just love this: the prop, the pull, the point, the light. We've talked about it with Jonah, and we'll come back and talk about this in terms of comparison. Get into some of those other universal monsters right after this.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Luke Norsworthy as we talk about his book, Befriending Your Monsters, and focusing a lot of our time and attention right now on these three universal monsters. And there's a very good reason for that. You might remember the name Henry Nouwen, who oftentimes said there are three lies. You know, I am what other people say or think about me. I am what I have, and I am what I do. So that's one of the reasons we're talking about things like comparison, more, and success. And you were pointing out not only with the book of Jonah, but even in each one of your chapters, you take the prop, the pull, the point, and the light. And if nothing else, I love the way you break that down because it helps us understand, Luke, what really is important and really what's driving the story, or in this case, what's driving that particular monster in your life.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I think that one of the biggest problems that many of us face is that we see what's right in front of us and we think that's the real issue. And we think the easiest thing for us to diagnose or detect is actually the source of the problem, when what most of us find is, as we try to work through who we are and what we've become, is that the real issue is underneath the surface.
Yes. So again, this one on the idea of comparison, certainly a big problem, but so that we can cover some of the others, let's move on, because one of the others is the issue of more, the idea that I need more, it's never enough. And in some respects, you again break that down to help us understand that sometimes we're not really understanding what it is that actually drives this consumer mentality, or even this kind of addictive mentality that some of us have adopted here in the 21st century.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the monster of more, and this idea that I constantly need more experience or pleasure or, fame or notoriety or whatever it is the idea that if I get enough of whatever substance that is, that I'll somehow be full. When the truth is, we are all these cracked vessels, that we are all groaning in this age waiting for redemption. And so there's nothing that we can put in this vessel that's going to fill it up. And once you start to accept that, then you start to diagnose and see things not as something that will be inept at filling a need that you want full, but instead you receive them not with a sense of desire for them to be something they can, but instead you receive them as what they are, and that is a gift. So whatever is in front of you stops having to fill a hole that it can never fill, but instead becomes this gift.
So again, part of that is to, again, break it down to what you say. The prop is I need more. The pull, never enough. The point, never full. And then what's the light, this idea of gifted? How does that maybe help us understand some of the things that are affecting us?
Well, I love the way that Brene Brown says that it's a practice of joy, that joy doesn't just naturally happen. You have to work at it. And when you start to develop this practice of working at gratitude, you live into what, Paul commands us, that, I command you to give thanks in all circumstances. So this idea of giving thanks in all circumstances becomes, as Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians, that it is God's will for us. God's will for you is to give thanks in all circumstances. And so as we live into this disposition, something happens to us, one, because we're living into God's will for us, because God's will is for us, again, to give thanks in all circumstances. And once you do the work at that, it changes your perspective on everything else, because it's like one time my brother gave me a Snuggie for Christmas. Now, I don't know if you've ever had a Snuggie before, but I would never buy one. It's like this weird combination of a blanket and a sweatshirt, which I don't have the book of Leviticus memorized, but I assume somewhere in Leviticus it says it's a sin to have those, because you shouldn't mix a blanket and a sweatshirt together. Nevertheless, he gave me one. It was a funny gag gift. And so I come home, I throw it behind my reading chair in my office, and I don't think about it until like a week later. I'm cold, and I realize, I have this Snuggie behind me. And so I do the unthinkable thing. I take it out of the bag, and I actually put it on. And it turns out it is quite functional. It's warm, and you can read at the same time. It's pretty amazing. But I never would have bought that gift for myself. I never would have. I never would have bought myself a Snuggie. But when it was gifted to me, I received it without asking questions. In the same way that every good and perfect gift comes down to us from the Father of lights, we start to receive everything, whether it is an extra moment we get in solitude because we're sitting in traffic, or whether it is a sprained ankle, which means we can't go outside, we have to stay home, or maybe more pressing right now is we are told that, we can't go certain places, we got to stay home, we got to quarantine. And for some of us, we're realizing that this might be a gift, because people like me, I've got 3 young daughters, I'm spending more time with them now than I ever have before. Like I was a somewhat involved present father, but this became a gift to me because now when I'm working from home, breaks are not me goofing around with my coworkers, but it's getting to go on a little bike ride with my daughters. And I see this as a gift.
So well said. And I love what you say. You know, if you were going to buy a house, you'd examine the home for flaws and faults and all sorts of things. But just imagine how different you would act if somebody just gave you that exact house as a gift. Well, whether you're talking about a Snuggie, and I'll never think of a Snuggie in a different way now that I've read your book, or a house, but apply that to spiritual gifts or gifts of time, talent, treasure, whatever it might be. I think it just, again, just illustrates that. But I want to keep it moving because we want to get to the other one, and that is success. I am what I do. Now, in some respects, there's a good bit of overlap, as you pointed out, with more, but let's talk our way through again the prop, the pull, the point, and the light, because, again, this desire to have success certainly affects all of us, and even people in ministry. Matter of fact, sometimes pastors get together. How many did you have in congregation this week? How many did you have? You know, so success is certainly an issue there as well. So what can you share about that with us?
Well, I think you're exactly right. Those of us in ministry, we often revert to maybe the lowest common denominator of our country, and our country loves to know someone's in the winner's circle. It's how we treat them. It's how we identify them. And early on in ministry, I realized like that happens in ministry just as much with any other vocation. I was a young man. I took over this interdenominational Bible study that had about 1,000 college kids coming to it, and it was that way before I was a preacher. So not all about me by any means. But I took it over, and I was 21 years old at the time, and I was going on a trip with Compassion International actually, and people asked what I did. There's this couple, 4 people who were on the same flight, and they asked what I did. I said, well, I'm in seminary, but I'm a preacher as well. And they go, where do you preach? And I told them, and they said their first question was, how many people will attend?
There you go.
Because that's their way of stacking up. Like, are you in the winner's circle or not? Mm-hmm. And if like you said, Henry, now it's the temptation is I am what I do. If I am what I do, I better be doing it well, because that determines if I'm in the winner's circle or not, which all of a sudden pulls us into understanding that how I perform, whether how good of a parent I am, how good of a preacher I am, whatever it is, that defines me. So it's not like you lose at work or you got let go at work, but you failed. I'm a failure. I got fired. Those things are definition statements. But I think the point is that it never was about you. It never was about your performance. One of my favorite stories of the life of Jesus is he is baptized, comes up out of the water, and that voice from above says, this is my son with whom I'm well pleased. And you think about that in the time of Jesus' ministry. What has he done? He got lost when he was like 12 at the temple. He hasn't preached any sermons. He hasn't walked on water. He hasn't raised anyone from the dead. He hasn't done anything. The Sermon on the Mount hasn't been preached. Yet God looks at him and says, this is my son with whom I'm well pleased, before he did anything. And I think what happens when we no longer can hold on to the charade that we're always successful is that we've got to quiet our soul, and it's no longer the boos or the cheers that we hear, but instead it is the voice from above that says, this is my daughter. This is my son with whom I'm well pleased. Because you can't always be in the winner's circle. And so you've got to be somewhere else.
Wonderful. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation. We've talked about meeting monsters, and we've already focused now on 3 universal monsters: comparison and more and success. But after the break, I thought we might focus on some of the latter chapters there, the monster-friendly life. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about Luke, because it seems to me that not only has he written this book, but I understand that he has a podcast, so we're going to talk about that. And so you can learn a little bit more about him, find the podcast. There's also just a great little video that's on the website there as well. That's a nice kind of video book trailer. It's about 2.5 minutes long, so you might want to watch it. Then my suggestion is that you might want to click that share button, put it on your Facebook page or Twitter feed or something like that, and let other people know about this particular book. And again, as we mentioned just a minute ago, this is a great book for you to read through. But again, since he is a pastor and because he's put it in a format that I think works very well, this would be something you might want to teach in your small group. So when we come back, we're going to spend some time talking about the monster monster-friendly life, but also what's available on his website and how maybe some of you in areas of spiritual and biblical leadership might be able to use this to train and to teach others and to really begin a conversation about some of these things, some of these monsters that affect our lives. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Luke Norsworthy about his book, Befriending Your Monsters, Facing the Darkness of Your Fears to Experience the Light. All that coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We have a few more minutes as we talk about the book Befriending Your Monsters. Again, it's published by Baker. You perhaps can find it in your local bookstore, but we've given you an opportunity to get it both in paperback and Kindle. And Luke, the last section there, the monster-friendly life, how not to dress your monster, how not to find your monster, or where not to find your monster, and what not to expect from your monster. Each one of those kind of gives you some helpful suggestions on dealing with some of these things that are very significant temptations or monsters in our lives. So what would you recommend to listeners that say, okay, you've identified some of the problems in my life, what can I do about it?
Well, I would say the first thing you want to do is not expect something from your monster that's unrealistic. One of the things that I've gotten asked a lot is, how come the book is entitled Befriending Your Monster, not eradicating or defeating or vanquishing your monster? And the reason is because I can't write that book. I've never experienced that. I've never been able to get rid of everything I struggle with. And I don't think the Apostle Paul did either. I think the Apostle Paul prayed 3 times for a thorn to be removed from his flesh, and it didn't get removed. But instead, God told him, my grace is enough for you. And I would say one of the things that you see kind of across, different monster stories and different lores about monsters, which, again, we all know those are fake, is that monsters will get defeated, they'll go away, the town will have peace, and then all of a sudden the monster or the monster's mom or the monster sibling will come back and haunt the village again. And so they have to repeat, they have to defeat the monster, and then it will come back again after a period of peace. So you have this kind of cycle that it's times of ease and then times of struggle. And when it comes to us, there is no silver bullet that's going to get rid of every monster that we struggle with. But what we do have is the ability to realize that day by day, when you take it one step at a time, one day at a time, when you pray for your daily bread, God will show up and something miraculous happens, that you keep doing the work and you keep being faithful to the Spirit's lead in your life, and that God can change you.
And so, again, you talk about this idea of armor, approval, because if others like me, I may not be insignificant. Power, because if I get strong enough, nothing can hurt me. Pleasure, because if I can feel comfortable enough, I will not feel the pain. Control, because if I have control, I won't seem weak or small. First of all, as the old guy around the table, let's just admit that those things just never really happen. We're all looking for the silver bullet, as you mentioned. And back to the Apostle Paul used a good illustration. He says, I find myself doing the very things that I hate. Okay, if one of the great leaders of the Christian world admits that it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes 3 steps forward, 4 steps back, that gives me an understanding that this is part of sanctification, part of the growth as a Christian, and I'm never going to completely defeat my monster, but maybe I can learn how, as you said, to befriend my monster and understand that these are going to be temptations, but I certainly can depend upon God's Spirit working in my life to get a victory over those from time to time.
Yeah, I think that's it. You mentioned the psychiatrist who came up with the phrase inferiority complex. He talks about those 6 different things that we use to kind of mask these senses, the sense of inferiority. Those all, like you said, they turn out to be futile because we can't be good enough. We can't overcome. We can't be successful. We can't master enough things. But what we do have, and this is my perspective as a person of faith, is we have the Spirit's work in us. And I think what happens is that you do these small things every day. You submit to prayer. You submit to times of reading Scripture. You submit to confessing or helping the poor or, being in an intentional community with other people. What happens is I think God shows up in those moments in a way that you start to change. And all of a sudden, what had a death grip on you 10 years ago, it might still be there. But the way that you've been shaped and molded over that last decade is that you become a person who's aware that it is always present. The struggle is always there. But I've found ways to rely on God's Spirit so that I can have a life that is faithful to who God wants me to be, even if I'm always going to be tempted with these things.
Just before we run out of time, I wanted to get 2 things on the table. One, how maybe some of our listeners who are in positions of leadership can use the book. And then second of all, we have a link to your website because I want people to know about your podcast and some of the work that you're doing. But first of all, any individual, Luke, can read this and benefit tremendously. But the way you've put it together, I think could really be used in a small group or a Bible study. What have you found? Hey,
Tim, from your lips to God's ears, let's make that happen. I think you're right on. Let's do it. Obviously I wrote this, part of the way I write, at least at this stage of my life, is I'm trying to make sense of my own struggles and my own issues, and the book was a great excuse to do that. So, it was very autobiographical and personal for me, but I do think it would be a great conversation starter. And, from what I've found, a lot of people have issues with comparison or success or wanting more than what they have. And so, I think in your groups or, as a sermon series, I think go for it. I love the idea.
And so that's one idea. The other is let's go to your website. It's LukeNorsworthy.com. Even you don't have to know how to spell it because we've got the link there. And you've got a podcast and all sorts of other things. So when you click on the podcast, you have all sorts of different individuals. The first one that pops up there is Jonathan Merritt, who's been in the studio with us before, The Monster of Success. You have one by Manda Carpenter on The Monster of Comparison. You have one by Annie Downs on The Monster monster of more. And the point I'm making is that then that podcast could be used by some of these teachers, and people could benefit tremendously from not only what you've written in the book, but even then they could play that or pull excerpts out and use that in a way for their teaching. So talk about what is available to our listeners.
Well, like you said, I'm fortunate enough that I get to do a podcast. And so I've had a couple of my friends come on the podcast and talk about the specific monsters. Jonathan Merritt, some of your listeners might know his father, James, who was former president of the SBC, Southern Baptist Convention. And so he came on as someone who wanted to talk about the monster of success. My friend Annie F. Downs, who maybe some of your listeners know from her podcast, the That Sounds Fun podcast, or 100 Days to Brave. She's someone who's able to give kind of her take on the monster of more. So, we've got some examples of some of my friends talking about those monsters. And, what I think is really encouraging for a lot of people is to have other people really put the skin in the game of what those monsters look like for them. Because vulnerability in others is something we see as bravery, but vulnerability in ourselves seems like weakness. And sometimes we don't want to be that vulnerable and talk about our struggles, but to let someone else set the example for us can really give us some freedom. So hopefully those things do that for you.
Let me just mention we have a link to your Facebook posts and Twitter posts and those kinds of things. We, of course, have a link there not only to this book, Befriending Your Monsters, but the previous book, God Over Good. And so that is another resource that is available. So if nothing else, there's just a lot of opportunity here for people to come to grips with some of their fears, some of their temptation, and to get victory over them. And so if nothing else, I appreciate Luke not only writing the book, but thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View so that we could get into this in more detail.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much. I'm very honored. Thank you.
Let me just, before we wind down today, just mention that, as he points out, we all know that the monsters that we see in our film and even monsters we read about in our books, and he does talk about someone like Frankenstein and werewolves and things like that, but we know that they are fake. But the reality is that even though those are fake monsters, there are monsters in our lives, and I think he does such a great job of really breaking it down into the three areas. The monster of comparison. I am what others say about me. The monster of more. I am what I have. And the monster of success. I am what I do. So if you find yourself saying, golly, this is a pretty good book. It is published by Baker. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have a way for you to get it both in paperback and Kindle. And it may be something you might want to use to teach others in your community, because I think you're going to find that very helpful. And if you'd like to know more about his podcast, that is available there as well. And of course, we have all sorts of great information, as we always do, on our website, which is pointofview.net. Thank you for joining us this hour right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed. Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to be talking this hour about apologetics, and in particular, practical apologetics. And if you've listened to this program any length of time, you know that we want to help you be able to articulate a biblical worldview and also understand how to defend a biblical worldview. And that's what apologetics is all about. I'm going to be talking about this book called Everyday Apologetics, Answering Common Objections to the Christian Faith. It is endorsed by all sorts of people that we've had in this program, Dr. Paul Copan and J. Warner Wallace and Dr. Scott Ray and Gary Habermas, of course, the introduction even by Dr. Sean McDowell. But you're going to have a chance to hear from some individuals that we've not interviewed before that maybe you do need to know about, and especially because of their work in this area of apologetics in Canada. So I think this is going to be helpful for you in that regard. And if, as we talk about this, you say, I'd really like to get a copy of this book, there are 10 chapters that I think you will see are very practical on the subject of everyday apologetics. And we, of course, have that information at our website at pointofview.net. First of all, let me introduce Dr. Paul Chamberlain. He is the director of the Institute for Christian Apologetics at the Trinity Western University. He's a professor of ethics, philosophy of religion, leadership, Christian apologetics, and others. In the past, he's worked with Ravi Zacharias, and you may have seen some of his books, Can We Be Good Without God? Confronting 7 Challenges to Christian Faith, Why People Don't Believe is really kind of the premise there. A Guide to Moral Persuasion, Why People Stop Believing. And Dr. Paul Chamberlain, thank you so much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you so much, Kerby. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I think this is our first time together.
And I'm looking forward to this. And let me introduce another individual as well, and that is Chris Price, who was kind of a lead pastor up there in the area of British Columbia, and then has been now pursuing church planting in Vancouver. Remember when I went to Regent College, I lived in Vancouver, BC, and certainly have loved the Fraser Valley and all of the rest. Author of a book, for example, Radical Hope, Resurrection, Faith in a Hurting World, and, of course, this one, Everyday Apologetics. Chris, thank you for joining us as well.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Let's, if we can, maybe come with you, Dr. Chamberlain, for a moment and talk about how this book came together. It's a kind of a who's who of people that you've worked with, but I would say that for most of our listeners, these would be unfamiliar names, but they are not unfamiliar topics, because you have a section on defending the faith, a section on answering some of the key objections, some of which we've talked about on this program, and a whole section on building a positive case. So tell us how this book actually came together.
Well, it's an interesting story, Kerby. About 7 or 8 years ago, I was using a different text called Everyday Theology by somebody you may have heard of, Dr. Kevin Van Hooser, using this book as a text. And then I discovered the book was actually written by him and his students. And I thought, well, I routinely get wonderful, excellent academic work done by my students. I grade, I mark it, send it back, and then it goes in the file, and that's all that ever happens to it. And I thought, somehow we need to get this out. Maybe there's ways I can work with students and we can put something together called Everyday Apologetics. I had the idea in my mind, bandied it around, and nothing really happened for 4 or 5 years. And then Chris came to me one day, and I really should pass it over to Chris right now, because Chris came with a solid reason as to why we need to move ahead on this book, he said, and he had a real key idea of what this book ought to look like. Chris, you should just tell him what you told me when you came.
Yeah, well, I just was well aware that a lot of the apologetics literature on the market, though very helpful and rigorous and academic was overshooting a lot of everyday people in the pews that attend our churches, and I was acquainted with many of them. And so I remember Paul dropping that idea on me years earlier, and I had friends who might not have been Paul's students, but were pastors and theologians and apologists writing and speaking to people, everyday people with everyday objections. And I went to Paul, hey, why don't we try to gather these unique voices who are experienced at explaining complex ideas to just everyday people in our churches who might not have theology degrees or philosophy degrees. And Paul, of course, because it was his idea, jumped on it. And that was really the birth of the project.
And I think it's such a very important issue because sometimes, as you might gather, we do apologetic programs on this program. And then as I get a chance to go out and visit different radio stations across the United States, I sometimes have people saying, well, when you have the apologetics, sometimes I understand it, sometimes I don't. And, you know, you have some people that are really brilliant, like William Lane Craig and Paul Copan, and every once in a while they'll drop in a couple of words and everybody goes, okay, I'm lost, you know. But, Chris, one of the things you did in the introduction on Why Everyday Apologetics is you list the questions that an 11-year-old boy asked his mother, and these are many of the questions that are being addressed here, and I think it really set the scene for the fact that we really need to understand how to answer these questions because kids as young as 11 years of age are asking very important questions for which there are answers, but if they're locked away in theological tomes, they're never going to get those answers, are they?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the things that is new and we need to realize. The questions might be perennial. They might be issues that we've heard about before, things like the problem of evil or faith in science. But with the nature of the internet, now these objections and these tirades against faith are so accessible. And so you have kids as young as 10 years old getting videos sent to them. Sometimes they look for them, sometimes they stumble upon them, and there are people raising these objections forcefully and with passion and with argumentation. And so you have young kids more than ever now exposed to this kind of argumentation, which means that as parents, as youth workers, as brothers and sisters in Christ, we need to be aware of these issues, and we need to have responses that don't overshoot the mark. We need to have responses that are rooted in logic, but also use illustrations and stories and connect not just with people's minds and hearts, and that are understandable by a kid as young as 11. So it's really a key issue. I love how Sean McDowell writes that with the the ubiquity, the everywhere present nature of the internet, difficult questions seem to be arising now more than ever. And so it just highlights the need for a book like this.
Well, and again, let me take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into this, but even my own testimony, I wish we had books like this when I became a Christian, because, you know, what did we have? Of course, I'm the oldest one around the table here, but, we had Mere Christianity, Basic Christianity. When I went off to college, then a guy by the name of Josh McDowell wrote a book, which was Evidence for Faith and Evidence Demands a Verdict, and then a little bit of Norm Geisler. And now, of course, we have an unbelievable number of books and resources and videotapes out there, but nevertheless, that is certainly the case. So first of all, I want to come back. I want to talk about really the need to defend the Christian faith, and Dr. Paul Chamberlain has written a piece on responding to a new kind of skeptic. That is something we've talked about on this program before, because the way in which these questions are being asked by the skeptics, the so-called nuns or the new atheist and others, very, very different. So we want to try to set the scene there. Then we want to try to answer a few of those objections about in the Old Testament, God seems violent, and how to address that. Chris has written about this whole idea of suffering. And then we'll get into the issue of faith and science. Before we're done, maybe we'll talk about the reasonableness of God, maybe how the fine-tuning of the universe points to God, and, of course, the basis for our belief in the resurrection and much more. So just a fascinating book. We're going to get into it in more details right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Whenever this country has faced a national emergency, our political leaders have increased their power and authority. More power flows to the national government, and usually more power flows from Congress to the executive branch. President Roosevelt expanded the federal government during the Great Depression with his New Deal programs. President Bush created huge agencies, the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence after the attack on 9/11. The exception has been the response from the Trump administration during this pandemic. Although the president's critics have often accused him of being a dictator, some would have to admit that they were surprised that he has encouraged governors to make more of the decisions while clearing away federal regulations that may have prevented a more effective response. So far, federal agencies and departments have taken more than 600 regulatory actions. These were proposed as temporary actions of deregulation, but President Trump signed an executive order last month directing these agencies to review the actions and determine which, if any, would promote economic recovery if made permanent. Truck drivers that are hauling emergency supplies have been given more flexibility about their hours. Seniors have been allowed to consult with their doctors using FaceTime or other forms of telemedicine. Colleges have been allowed to ramp up their distance learning without governmental red tape. The Trump administration seems intent on keeping this coronavirus crisis from expanding the federal government. And if these new ventures in telemedicine and offline education are working, why should they stop when the crisis is over? Why shouldn't these temporary waivers be made permanent? What usually follows national emergencies is more power consolidated in the federal government. The Trump administration seems to be breaking that typical pattern in American history. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Our topic this hour is Everyday Apologetics, answering common objections to the Christian faith. And before we get to some of those common objections, let's see if we can go to our two editors, Paul Chamberlain and Chris Price. And Dr. Chamberlain, let's talk about the world in which we find ourselves in. You talk about, one of your authors talk about the nagging doubts that strengthen my faith. But more importantly, you wrote a piece about this new kind of skeptic. We live in a world today where there's always, in some respects, been attacks on Christianity, but even now we're seeing a different kind of skeptic than we've ever seen before. Please explain.
Well, it's very, yes, thanks. It's very interesting and very serious in my mind. The type of skeptic I'm talking about is a person who is a former member of some religious group, often an evangelical group or a Catholic group, or maybe a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness, or who knows, it could be a different one as well. But I was brought face to face with this by a number of things that just confronted me directly. One was I heard that a colleague of mine who had been a solid evangelical guy during my PhD program had turned completely. In fact, he sent an email to me saying he was now on the dark side, kind of in a funny, humorous way. But he was a brilliant guy and very, very active in arguing for atheism as time has gone on. I was called upon to debate at an atheist convention up here in Canada, along with a friend. We were the opening warm-up act of this entire weekend convention from atheists all around the world. And so there we were ready to start, and I began to realize, look at the two atheists we're debating here. One was a former Southern Baptist who was training for ministry. One was a former Catholic altar boy. And then I began looking around and I thought, what would cause atheists to come together to celebrate as they are? And I began to realize almost everybody in that room was passionate about their atheism because they were all in this same group, former members of some religious group from which, in their mind, they'd been set free. And now they're celebrating their liberated status as atheists, or harsh skeptics. And I began to realize that these kinds of skeptics are different, these kind of critics, because they're sometimes very passionate, often very passionate. They're often very knowledgeable about the Bible because in many cases they were leaders, former pastors, theologians, theology students, etc. And they know exactly the types of reasons that we are probably going to give them. They know the responses. They don't find them convincing because they've walked away from them. And they're often, as I say, quite passionate about it. And I began to realize we need to prepare for this kind of skeptic in a different way. We need to really understand why they left, what were their arguments, what were their reasons. And sometimes they're intellectual, sometimes they're not. Usually there's a mix of both. And see if we can somehow get prepared, because there's a wave of this kind of thing going on in our culture. In groups, I often will ask, how many of you know somebody who is a former Christian who has now walked away? Almost every hand in the room will go up now routinely. And I'll even ask, how many of you know somebody who was a former pastor or leader or teacher in the Christian community? Again, many hands go up. And some of the most sad Christian people I have come to talk to me after are those whose children are in that group who've walked away. And sometimes it's even their siblings, or maybe in the occasional case, their parents who've walked away. And it really gets their attention. So that's why we devoted a chapter to this in the book.
And again, if you think about this in 2 Peter, Peter warns about those false teachers who arose from among you. And so whether it's a Bart Ehrman who went to some of these schools, or, of course, we've talked on this program many times about very prominent musicians, or in some cases, individuals that maybe were involved in theology that went the other direction. So, and of course, what's influencing them are the so-called skeptics and others. And so we really run into this kind of situation in which, first of all, we have some that just aren't necessarily interested in religion. I felt as we do our millennial roundtable, we have, I just sometimes get to participate, even though I'm not a millennial, obviously, but they will point out that you've got a good number of individuals that find themselves not necessarily hostile to Christianity. They just simply don't care. But these skeptics you're talking about, they're very hostile, and they came from some of our same Bible colleges and seminaries, didn't they?
They certainly did, and that's the part that when you first realize that, it comes as a shock, and then you realize, oh, there's a whole wave of this, and you start talking and asking them questions. Then you really get into it, and you realize, in most cases, the most prominent thing they say is, these structures of religion were kept me bound, and they kept me from thinking clearly and freely. Now I've been totally set free from this. And they're very passionate, and they know our stuff as well as anybody else, and that's exactly right. It's a different kind of skeptic in that way.
Yes. Well, if nothing else, that's one of the reasons why we encourage, as we have before, for you, especially if you're sending a young person off to college or just out into the world, to go to a college prep or a Mind Games or a Summit Ministries or something like that, to be prepared. But let's, if we can, get into the second section of the book, because that's really what the subtitle is, Answering Common Objections. And so, Chris, let me come to you, because you wrote a chapter here on why does God allow suffering? Now, this is one of those perennial issues. If there's a good God, why is there suffering in the world? But you take us through trying to answer that question without getting into some of these difficult theological terms, but just trying to answer the question that legitimately a lot of people obviously ask.
Yeah, I'd love to, because it is a perennial question. It's one that doesn't just challenge our minds, but affects us emotionally. Often philosophers will separate the problem into a logical component and an emotional component, and I think most of us deal with it on an emotional level first. Something happens to someone we love or in our lives, and we're left wondering why. Why did this happen? And we just feel it so deeply, and it's so painful. And so not only do we need logical responses, we need pastoral wisdom when it comes to this question. And in the chapter, I do look at some common logical responses that have a history in the church. I look at the free will defense, this idea that God's given us freedom, which allows room for love and virtue and relationship and reason, but also makes possible evil and injustice. We have abused and misused this good gift of freedom. I talk about something called the soul-making theodicy. Theodicy just means justifying the ways of God to people, and that goes back in church history to a man named Irenaeus, and it just talks about how suffering can actually produce good in our lives, not by accident. We have to cooperate with what God wants to do in refining us. And you think there of Bible verses like in the book of James where it talks about, trials having this refining aspect in our lives if we receive them from God and allow the Holy Spirit to work through us. And so I look at those two responses, but really where I land is this idea that as Christians, we believe in a God who is not aloof, a God who is not uninvolved, but a God who, in his son Jesus, enters into suffering, who suffers with us and because of us and for us, and ultimately to take all suffering away from us, because so many things will happen in our lives where we won't have an answer, and free will or soul making will seem maybe even trite or like it's not speaking to us where we're living. But when we look at Jesus and when we think about what he suffered for us, he didn't have to, he chose to out of love. That becomes a God I think we can still trust, the God who didn't try to, in the words of Peter Kreeft, get himself off the hook for suffering, but instead a God who put himself on the hook of suffering for us. And I look at this idea that really the death and resurrection tells us that sin and evil is real. That's why Jesus had to die. But it also reminds us that God's love is real, which is why Jesus was willing to die. And then it assures us that God's power is real when Jesus rose from the dead, telling us that death itself will one day die. And really the death and resurrection of Jesus allows us to hold together the reality of God's goodness, power, and the existence of evil like nothing else does. And then, of course, I talk about the hope we have in a new heavens and a new earth. And then it ends with just some pastoral reflection on how we can enter into suffering in a way that doesn't trivialize what people are going through, but instead offers comfort and solace in the midst of it.
Very good. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we will continue our conversation. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about this book, we have a link. You may be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we've made it very easy for you to get it in paperback. Everyday Apologetics, Answering Common Objections to the Christian Faith. We've talked a little bit about some of the skeptics. We've talked about the whole issue of suffering. We come back, let's, if we can, maybe focus a little bit of time and attention on the issue of science, because as we have talked about, not only with Dave Kinnaman, but even more recently with George Barna, sometimes that's a deal breaker for especially some young people that think, well, I'm in the science area, and so science and faith are in conflict, so I can't believe that. And yet this is coming at a time when we have probably more evidence in terms of fine-tuning that point to the existence of a creator God. So we'll talk about that and really get into this whole idea, is it reasonable to really believe in God? And then of course, end by talking about the resurrection and meaning of life. And so if you find yourself saying, I'd like a really good, practical, everyday apologetics book, that's what this is. And we'll continue our conversation right after these important messages.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Might just want to sit back and take some notes, but we'll take some calls in just a minute if you'd like to join us as we talk about everyday apologetics. But before we do so, let's again go back to the individuals that have put this together, Dr. Paul Chamberlain and Chris Price. And Dr. Chamberlain, let's talk about this issue of science. When we have done interviews in the past with individuals that have surveyed either Christians who have left the faith or non-Christians who have never really seriously considered Christianity and ask why, well, you hear a lot of answers. You know, Christians are hypocritical, they're judgmental or intolerant. But one of those that surfaces time and time again is, well, Christianity is anti-science. And if I'm going to be in the sciences and if I believe in rationality, then indeed I just can't become a Christian because, after all, faith and science are in conflict. One of the chapters there really addresses that issue. How might you respond?
Yeah, I'm always very disappointed when I hear people having trouble with Christianity based on that kind of perception. I mean, all you need to do is look at some of the top-notch scientists even today. Francis Collins is a good example, or John Polkinghorne, or John Lennox, or even go back to the beginning, people like Francis Bacon, Galileo, Blaise Pascal, Isaac Newton, Johannes Kepler. You could keep on going with name after name of scientists, of people who claim to be Christians, who call themselves Christians, and who believe they were. And this is something that completely baffles someone like Richard Dawkins. He simply does not know what to do with this fact that he finds people who he knows are top-rate scientists, but yet who believe the essential fundamentals of the Christian faith. And when I look at this, I say to myself, there really is no inherent conflict here. As Francis Bacon himself said, the best way, I think, to look at this is to realize that God wrote two books. One is the book of creation. The other is the book of the Bible. The same author wrote these two books. And I guess what that means to me is that if we understood both of them perfectly, we would see there's absolutely no conflict. And that should lead us to realize that there really is no inherent conflict. So when people on one side or the other of that debate say things to create conflict, I'm always wishing we could go back and find out, what are you saying? Why are you creating conflict here? Because there is no inherent conflict, because the same author is behind both of them. And I think it's a wonderful thing. When I've read into this issue, what I found is that the early scientists were people often who were clergymen, who got into a scientific discovery because they were so intrigued by what they saw in nature around them, and they wanted to increase their admiration and their awe for the creator of what they saw in nature, and that's what motivated their scientific discovery. And I look at science itself and nature, and the first thing that it does is points to something that must be behind it. And as the author in this book, Kirk Thurston, who's a PhD in biophysics, brings out very well in our textbook here, in our book, that either the cause of nature is there's only two options, either a natural cause or a non-natural cause. And since things can't create themselves, you're really only left with one option, and that is there must be some non-natural, in other words, supernatural cause standing behind the universe. And I think we find that kind of thing all the way through. There is no inherent conflict, and actually science and nature point back to them, point away from themselves to the God behind it all.
Let's, if we can, maybe talk about this idea of the reasonableness of God, but I thought I would go to one of our callers here that wanted to join the conversation. And Jeannie, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for taking my call. I appreciate this program very much. And I was wondering how atheists continue to use God in in refuting God. So if they don't believe that there's a God, why should they even use his name?
Or, one of the other ones that we've used before here, and I can go to either to Paul or Chris, is that sometimes they will be angry with God when they say they don't believe in God. And I even remember C.S. Lewis saying that in one of his works. So what about this? On the one hand, they deny the existence of God, and on the other hand, they tend to hold God responsible for everything that happens. They reject the idea of moral absolutes. They reject the Bible, but then they use moral standards to judge evil in the world. What are your thoughts about that?
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, well, I find that very intriguing. I think it was Douglas Wilson, an author and apologist, who said there's two tenets to atheism. God does not exist, and I hate him. There's a lot of angst and anger, it seems, directed towards this God who doesn't exist in the minds of many atheists. And I do think there's a sense in which Frank Turk wrote a book called Stealing from God, where he looks at the ways in which atheism borrows from a theistic worldview to attack theism. And so a great example would be one of the topics covered in the book, violence in the Old Testament. People look at what the Israelites did with the Canaanites and protest. That is wrong. And not just wrong to them, but objectively wrong for all people in all places in all time periods. But of course, if God doesn't exist, what kind of foundation do you have for that type of objective moral statement that applies to all people in all times? And so what they're doing really is jumping into a biblical worldview to attack the Bible while denying the source of the moral values. And so there's a real inconsistency and incoherence within the atheistic worldview in some of these objections against God, which the caller highlights there.
And one of the examples I've used is years ago, I moderated a presentation that Ravi Zacharias had put together, and they had Christians and atheists and all sorts of individuals. But the atheist all the way through there was making judgments about the Holocaust, apartheid, Jim Crow, whatever. And then, of course, William Lane Craig, who's there, and others were raising the question, well, wait a minute. You just denied the existence of any moral standard. Now you're using a moral standard to judge this. And even the atheists in the front row started kind of looking at their shoes because they recognized that was a pretty good argument. So, Gene, you've just kind of got us started on this whole chapter, chapter 7, the reasonableness of belief in God, because even people trying to reject the idea of God find themselves coming back to that. So, Dr. Chamberlain, just talk about that, because that chapter really gets us into this idea of God as well, right?
Well, yes, exactly. And I would make one more comment about Jeannie's call, because I think it's a very intriguing call, and I see this all the time in my own studies or in my own interaction. And I think we should think about ways that it can help us move into productive conversations with atheists. And why wouldn't we simply point out that if suppose an atheist raises the question of the Savior God of the Old Testament who acted in very harsh and immoral ways? Why not simply point out that you and I'm a theist, a Christian theist, you're an atheist. We really don't have a disagreement when you think about it, because you don't think God did those things, because you don't believe there is a God. I don't believe God acted in unjust, immoral ways either. So you and I really don't have as much a disagreement here as we think we do. And what that does is then force us to get very precise on exactly what is the atheist objection here. And I've always encouraged students, start there. It takes some time with this. Clarify the objection as carefully as you can. And you realize that in some cases, the objection is harder to make than we might think. And in fact, that's one of the things that leads us into your question about the reasonableness of belief in God. Well, I'm not sure what we need to say there, but I find that in my first tack on the reasonableness of God is to find out from people, what is it that you find unreasonable about belief in God? Because at face value, it seems to me one of the most reasonable things you could believe. You have an entire universe sitting here. You have information here. We have consciousness in our minds here. We have love. We have beauty. We have moral value, objective moral value. How do you explain these things if there's not some kind of supernatural, transcendent being standing behind it all? If you're an atheist, your atheism has a lot of heavy lifting to do to somehow explain all those things. And so it seems to me right off the bat, and I just share with people, that belief in God seems highly rational and highly reasonable to me. If it seems unreasonable to you, please tell me why, so we can talk about that.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into a little bit more of that, because Chapter 7 on the reasonableness of a belief in God even has a section there on evidence from the microscope, and certainly we can talk about that in terms of DNA and the idea of a genetic code. When you talk about a code, you usually think of a code giver and those kinds of things. Then Chapter 8 talks about, if you will, evidence from the telescope in terms of the fine-tuning. So we'll come back and just briefly look at that as well, because it's got some great material. I love it. Free throws and fine-tuning, royal flushes in a fine-tuned universe, and some of the probability issues real quickly. And then I thought I might come to Chris, and we'll talk a little bit about this idea of the resurrection, since, of course, you have written on that subject as well. And then just the whole idea of the meaning of life. But if you find yourself saying, I'd kind of like to get a book that is easy to read and really maybe provides some everyday apologetics, I think this is the book. And you will find it very helpful. 10 chapters, about 300 pages, but it's in a small format. And we are talking today with the two people that have edited it and also written in it, Dr. Paul Chamberlain and Chris Price. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about what they're doing as well, maybe you have friends in Canada that you would like to have them know more about what they are doing in the church and in that Institute of Christian Apologetics and things of that nature, we have all that information, as well as information about the book, on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for just a few more minutes as we talk about this book, Everyday Apologetics. Dr. Paul Chamberlain and Chris Price with us. And Dr. Chamberlain, let me come to this whole idea of the fine-tuning. There are a lot of good arguments for the existence of God and cause and effect and fine-tuning and all the rest, but that is become a very significant one in the scientific community because you have this universe as well as our galaxy, our solar system, even the very physical constants that all are fine-tuned. It's like you have a bunch of dials in a room and every one of them is perfect and move a little to the left, a little to the right of that dial, and the universe doesn't exist. And to me, that's a pretty powerful argument. What are your thoughts?
I agree. I love this. And I love hearing people in the scientific community who really understand it express it. What's interesting to me about it is that I first began hearing this from Christians who would speak about it. But then I discovered a few years back that fine-tuning is widely accepted in the scientific community by virtually everybody. That fact is not even controversial. So when we talk about the force of gravity, as you say, if it was a tiny little bit less or a tiny little bit greater than it is, the universe would either expand too rapidly or it would collapse upon itself. The cosmological constant, which is like an anti-gravity repulsive force, the same thing, a minuscule alteration would cause the universe either to expand too rapidly for galaxies and stars or collapse back upon itself. And all these things, and there's a whole series of these, and they're accepted by those in the scientific community across the board. So the question is, well, what does it mean? And I like your illustration. I've heard that. I use that one as well about a radio with 7 or 8 or 10, or we can say maybe a couple dozen, 20 dials, all set to the exact place where they need to be for the music to come on. And when you walk into the barn and there's the music coming on, you assume someone has been there already setting the dials. Of course, it's always possible that maybe by some chance the dials all got set, and set them all in the right place. But we would never believe that because it's just far too improbable. I even remember watching an atheist scientist at Stanford University, one of the founders of string theory, commenting on this, and they asked him, "How do you explain it?" And he commented on the chance explanation, and he simply said, "I don't think so. There's too many zeros behind the 10 when we talk about the chances. I don't think so." And I was really intrigued by that. I find it to be a very interesting way that God has just given us, once we understand science, to see, again, one more way that simply points back to a divine mind and creator behind the universe who set things up in a way conducive to human life forming.
Yes. And again, there's some great illustrations there of a number of free throws in an area, or just even getting a royal flush in a deck of cards, all sorts of things. But I want to leave some time for the resurrection, because Chris, if nothing else, I know that your previous book, Radical Faith, Resurrection Faith in a Hurting World, I know you'd want to speak to chapter 9, because it talks about, Mark Clark, the hope of the resurrection. And when the Apostle Paul really set forth, if you will, his apologetic in 1 Corinthians 15, where does he go? He goes to the resurrection. So how is that perhaps one of the most important things to bring up today, even in the 21st century?
Right. Well, I think for us, it really starts to define who this God is that we're talking about. This is a God who's not just some kind of deistic creator who fine-tune things and set things in motion. This is a God who cares for us and who's involved in creation and who has proven it by entering into history through his son, Jesus. And Jesus, of course, identified himself with God in his teachings. He did miracles, but then he died, and it seemed like all hope was lost. And then 3 days later, he rose again from the dead. And so what I do in that book and what Mark does in this chapter is talk about the fact that if God exists, miracles are possible. In fact, if you believe that God created the universe, you already believe in a miracle bigger than anything you read in the Bible. As someone once said, if you believe the first verse of the Bible, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, you can believe every verse after that, including miracles. And so what I do with the book on the resurrection and what Mark does in this chapter is he looks at all of those pieces of data, like the empty tomb or the appearances of Jesus to his followers or their transformed lives or the birth of the church and the direction the whole movement took. All of these things that historians across the board agree happened, and he presents the resurrection as the best explanation of all of those things. And what it does is give us such hope. And I tell the story of a woman I knew who passed away from cancer, and I was with the family towards the end of her life. And I remember the 8-year-old granddaughter drew a little picture of her grandma walking into heaven, and through a doorway, and above the doorway there was a sign that said, "No more tears." And she drew a little garbage can, and the grandma was throwing a tissue into the garbage can, and there was a caption that said, "No, no more tissues, because there's no more tears." And that picture gave such hope to the family. And we know it's not a naive hope or a false peace because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that Jesus went through death and came out the other side, which means he can take us through death out the other side into God's new heavens and new earth. And in that, there is such hope and such peace that is concrete and real, and what Peter calls a living hope available for all who trust in him. And so that's the good news that comes out of this case for the resurrection of Jesus being a real, factual, historical event.
Paul Chamberlain, just before we run out of time, let's talk about how people can use this book. I would think anybody could pick up this book, read through the 10 chapters and benefit. But I do know we have a lot of listeners that maybe are Bible fellowship teachers, small group leaders, maybe pastors and others. And the way you've put this together, it really could be a ongoing study for a small group, couldn't it?
I think it could be a perfect book for that. We have exactly that kind of person in mind, Kerby. We found authors who we knew were good communicators and who already had a front row seat, who were already communicating and defending the Christian faith to people around them. So our hope is that people who already they have a desire to engage others with their faith. They want to do it, and they already are doing it. They can pick up a book like this and one by one get themselves prepared for the issue. So a Bible study group could take one evening and read the chapter, "Why is the Old Testament God so violent?" for example. And then come together in a group and discuss that chapter and get a working knowledge of the ideas in that chapter so they can actually use them in discussion. And that's the point of the book. And then the next week, why does God allow suffering? Read that and come together in a group and discuss the issues, get what I call a working knowledge. I remember taking Apologetics from Dr. William Lane Craig and way back when I was a student, and he said, this is the utmost of the practical courses, where we teach apologetics so you can actually use it. And that was our deep goal for this book, to read these chapters one by one and get prepared to use them in discussion with others. So being used in groups is wonderful. One group out in Alberta, Canada here, has already bought a shipment to give to inmates in the prison in a couple of apologetic programs they're running there. So we are really thrilled about that. But that is how we hope the book will be used, Chris, Kerby.
Let me just mention, too, that we have a link so that if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to find it in the bookstore, you may or may not, but we have it there. And I suspect once you get a copy, you'll probably want to do the same thing and order multiple copies for people that you'll be educating and teaching and preparing them for this 21st century world. So, Paul and Chris, it's been great to have you on the program. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's been wonderful. Thank you, Kerby.
Let me just mention again that we have information about both of them, and if you find yourself saying, I'm going to be in Vancouver and I'd like to hear Chris Price teach, or I might even be interested in a seminary class or find out more about what's happening there at Trinity Western University, you can certainly find all of that on our website as well. It's all available at pointofview.net. One last time, the book is entitled Everyday Apologetics, Answering Common Objections to the Christian Faith, and the editors have been with us, Paul Chamberlain and Chris Price. That's all we have for this hour right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, let me open up with a question. Do you think maybe that we have turned some of these things that are around us, some of the things that we value, into maybe like a secular idol? And if you would agree with that, and I suspect that you might, I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation this hour as we talk about this book called Seculosity, and that is how career, parenting, technology, food, politics, and romance became our new religion, and what to do about this. And it comes from David Zahl. He is the founder and director of Mockingbird Ministries. A little bit later, in addition to talking about the book, we'll also talk about the journal, The Mockingbird, and also the Mockingcast, and a number of other things that you will certainly benefit from as well. You may have seen some of his other books, one that I remember people talking about, The Mess of Help from the Crucified Soul of Rock and Roll, as well as Law and Gospel, a theology for sinners and saints. But we're going to be talking about this book today on Seculosity, and he is a lay preacher in the Episcopal Diocese in Virginia. So, David, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me, Kerby. I'm glad to be here.
I might just mention that even as I was looking through your particular journal, one of the things that is an interview in there, which I thought was fascinating, is a conversation we had this time last week about Tom Holland, who is not necessarily a Christian by any stretch of the imagination, an individual that writes about ancient cultures, but nevertheless has kind of had a very significant turnaround in terms of Christianity, and has acknowledged that Christianity really makes a positive contribution, which I think is kind of fun. So we'll get to the journal a little bit later, but encourage people to go to your website as well, the Mockingbird website, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But this book really is an attempt to help us understand that in this kind of secular world, we've created a seculosity of business, romance, parenting, technology, work, leisure, food, politics, and much more. And in some respects, what you're trying to do is help us understand that we've put a few things on the pedestal and we need to take them back off of that. True?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that what I'm always interested in why it is people today feel so exhausted. And you hear everyone talking about anxiety and loneliness, and you hear that it's kind of across the board. And so I've had my ear to the ground for quite a while, and I kept hearing people describe their daily pursuits in almost religious terms. So that they would be going to the gym, and it wouldn't just be a workout or a time to exercise their bodies, but they would be almost engaging in a liturgy, and there'd be all sorts of pep talks, and they would walk away being like, was I just in church? Or you get the same kind of pressure and anxiety about food, where you go to the supermarket, and answers to all of life's problems appear to be in different aisles. So we're living in a pressured time, and one of the ways that I've seen that, and I think is a helpful lens for other people in order to understand their lives, is this lens of seculosity.
First of all, you're a great writer and great turns of phrases, as well as, in this particular case, seculosity. So since there are 9 chapters and a conclusion, I want to keep the train moving down the road because I want people to hear a lot of that. But the first one is on what you call the seculosity of busyness. And if there is one issue that we have tried to address from time to time and even have some booklets on, it is the constant pressure to always be busy. And, of course, that relates very much to a chapter we'll get to later in terms of leisure, but just this fast-paced, frenetic lifestyle. You're in Virginia, but we broadcast in 42 states, including Virginia, and I don't see it really that different in any one of the states where we broadcast, perhaps a little more intense in the urban environment than the suburban environment. But here, almost busyness has become a religion of its own, hasn't it?
It has. I mean, it's the right answer to the question of how are you. It's you can't say I'm. It used to be you'd say I'm doing fine, I'm doing well, but now the default is usually I'm busy or I'm extremely busy.
Or crazy busy. I hear that all the time. I hear that all the time. Crazy busy, which should tell you something right there, shouldn't it?
I think so. I think people feel like the train is running off the tracks. And life is very, very overwhelming, just the pace of it. No matter who you are, it's up and down. Everywhere I go, people tell me that they're exhausted.
And then again, it's just a demand that is placed there because every once in a while I say, no, it's really very easy right now. And they'll go, what? And I'm doing that just to get the people's attention because you're supposed to say that I'm working really hard. Performance is the basis of my identity. And of course, as we go along, we'll talk about some of the problems. But if you identify as being busy and you get pats on the back for being busy, you can see why that has become, if you will, the default setting here in the 21st century. I think that's right. And you were rewarded for being busy, but the question is, is that our identity or is that just our a description of what life is like? And so you always have to ask yourself, what would it mean about me if I weren't busy? Mm-hmm. Am I somehow is that somehow equated to being guilty? Because that's not a biblical category. We talk about sin in the Bible as being missing the mark or committing doing something self-oriented that's against God's will, but we don't talk about just sheer productivity and kind of fast-pacedness. That's a construct that I think it grinds people down over the long haul, and you see it sometimes in churches. Let's face it, where there's a real pressure to always have more and more things going on, more programs, more opportunities. Yeah, and it gets back to kind of the conversation we had just the other day about the pressure for more, the pressure for comparison, and some of the rest. So when we come back from the break, let's, if we can, get into a few more. The seculosity of romance, which I think would surprise some people, but that one will certainly be important. And then the one that I think we'll probably camp out on for just a little bit, the seculosity of parenting, which gets us back into comparison and some of the very important issues there. And again, just some great turns of phrases, which I've appreciated as well, the parenting industrial complex and so much more. Then we'll get into the issue of work and leisure and technology. Already mentioned food a little bit. Oh, we haven't even gotten into the issue of politics and the seculosity of Jesus land, so we'll talk about that. And then finally, what to do about all of this. So if this connects up with you, I think you'll really appreciate this book. It is now out, and we have information about it on our website. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about some of the things that David is doing, if you'd like to find your way to the website, which is mbird, standing for Mockingbird, mbird.com, you can find that there, and of course all sorts of other great information, and of course the book, which I think you're going to really benefit from as well, that came out last month, is certainly available to you, and if you want to look for it in your local bookstore, fine, but we also have a link there for it in both hardcover and in Kindle. So let's come back and talk a little bit more about some other aspects of seculosity in our world and what to do about it. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Presidential campaigns in this country follow a predictable pattern. The Republican candidate caters to the conservative voters most likely to vote in the primaries. Once winning a nomination, the candidate sprints to the middle in order to win in the general election. A Democratic candidate does just the opposite by appealing to liberal voters. Once the nomination is secured, he or she sprints to the center to win the general election. That has been the pattern, but not this time. Joe Biden is doing just the opposite. During the Democratic primary, he was often perceived as a centrist candidate. Sometimes he would adopt some of the ideas of the progressive wing, but he was often seen as the one defending Obamacare and rejecting Medicare for all. He was the sensible alternative to progressives like Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Elizabeth Warren. Something happened on the way to the Democratic convention. He and his campaign have embraced more and more left-wing ideas. Kevin Williamson calls it the Biden inversion. Whatever it is unique to modern American politics. Running in the primaries is a time to shore up your support and energize your base. A little of that is still necessary during the general election, but most of the time the candidate needs to reach out to the voters in the middle who aren't convinced. A certain percentage of voters will vote for Donald Trump no matter who opposes him in the fall. A certain percentage of voters will vote Democratic whether Joe Biden was the nominee or not. The electoral battle is in the middle, but Joe Biden seems to be sprinting to the left. Taking strong progressive stands on issues will energize the left wing of the Democratic Party, but I think it risks losing voters in the center. If Joe Biden wins in November, he will have reversed a pattern that has been in place for decades. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, talking with David Zahl about his book, Seculosity. By the way, the book came out last year, and again, it is something that you perhaps can find in your local bookstore, but we've made it very easy for you to order both in hardcover and in Kindle. But David, let's, if we can, focus on a couple of the other chapters. One of those is the seculosity of romance, because, again, this whole idea of sex appeal, the idea of having a soulmate and a number of other issues is something where, in many cases, we are getting false views of what romance and what marriage and family are, sometimes because of books, Hollywood, and a variety of other things. So talk about this idea of the seculosity of romance.
Sure. Well, I think the seculosity of romance is basically anytime you're looking to another person to meet the needs that only God can really provide for. And when you hear someone describe what they're looking for in a wife, you think, oh my goodness, you want her to be absolutely everything to you. There's that famous movie in the '90s, Jerry Maguire, when he would say, "You complete me."
Yeah.
And you want to say, that's a lot of pressure to put on any woman. And certainly it's a lot of pressure for someone to put on me. And so am I looking for this person to complete me, to make me enough, or is this someone that I'm going to, walk through life with as we, make a family and things like that? So it's because when you have someone who your soulmate is basically a savior, that sets things up for a lot of expectation and resentment, I think. It's a model of romance that's really completely, it circles around self-fulfillment rather than self-divestment, or receiving rather than giving. And as Christians, I think that we understand love as something as giving, and that's I think that people experience that. Romance, of course, is a wonderful thing, and we want loving relationships in marriages, but to the amount of pressure we put on that to essentially save us from unhappiness or just boredom or just ourselves, that's a recipe for disaster.
Yes. And you think about the pressure we put on ourselves or on our marriage, it intensifies when, as we talk about then in the third chapter, the pressure we put on ourselves in terms of parenting. And my child is an honor student. I love that. The parenting industrial complex. You spend a fair amount of time just kind of addressing that issue because if no doubt, even in the churches where you've worked and other places, you see that there is not only the pressure to succeed and to be busy, but also this incredible pressure to be the perfect parent and the pressure to have a child that succeeds. And then, if you will, sometimes the shame that comes if that child does not succeed in the way that you really desired. So speak to that if you might.
Absolutely. Your child becomes a proxy or a substitute for your own enoughness, your own righteousness. And so that's a large burden to place on any 12, 13-year-old. And they feel that, but it's actually less of an arms race between how well your children are doing, at least when you have younger kids, and just how perfectly you're parenting them. Meaning, we're more concerned about what other parents think of us. And I joke with other dads who say that when I put the coat on my son in the morning to go to school, it's only 5% because I want him to be warm. It's 95% because I don't want other parents to judge me. And so, and we look to our children to be our immortality, our legacy, things like that. Again, it's another area which is wonderful. The gift of children is a beautiful thing. And yet, when we look to our children as religious objects, as that which can justify our existence, provide our value, our worth, our identity, well, then you're going to it's going to create enormous difficulties. And I'm not sure that's what God wants for parents and children.
Anybody that wonders about that, you have people that are actually serving time in prison because they lied for their children, misrepresented their children's athletic ability, academic ability, whatever, to get into the right school. And, of course, that is very visible because there have been some highly visible individuals. But, again, as you well know, having lived in New York and in Virginia and other places, the pressure to get them in the right prep school, the pressure to get them sometimes even in the right daycare is just, again, one of those things that has simply consumed some of these parents in ways that you would not even have imagined, say, maybe a generation ago.
I think so. The word that you keep using is right. And, as Christians, we believe in right and wrong when it comes to morality, but we don't believe that there's one school that will ensure their future success and every other school will squander it. So we've imported these moral categories into things that can't really hold them, I think. And so, and with that, the anxiety of it. So we're less concerned, perhaps, with rightness when it comes to, in this case, honesty or portraying your child accurately and transparently. And we're more concerned with what is right in terms of how other people view us, and the right bumper sticker to have in the back of the car, the right sticker that says, "I am a good enough parent because my child goes to this school." You can understand why people, in fact, would risk so much if their entire life is actually riding on where their child goes to school. Well, then no price is too big to pay. And of course, I think that it's an idol is the biblical language that we're talking about.
I think so. Let's see if we can talk about technology, the seculosity of technology. And I love what you say. I love technology. I swear, I really do. But you, somewhere there had a story that I just caught my attention, and that is, I've never thought about when you're doing communion, that it gives you an opportunity to see what kind of wristwatch people are wearing. And you found that some people wear these fancy timepieces, but sometimes they're wearing a fitness tracker. And if nothing else, it was just kind of an interesting thought. I never really even thought about that before. But this whole idea of technology has really consumed our world, hasn't it?
Well, I think so. Our phones feel like phantom limbs a lot of times. Just look at what happens when someone drops it in the pool or something like that. But when it comes to these trackers, Fitbits and whatnot, again, they can be very useful when it comes to getting your steps in. But all of a sudden, you're cheating.
Pressure. Yeah. Oh, now performance, achievement, right? Yeah.
I tell stories. The Wall Street Journal had some stories about some contests at work where some people were caught putting their little fitness trackers on a ceiling fan or on their dog in order to perform, because they all of a sudden you have a score. And anytime you're dealing with quantification in that regard, that over quantification, then you can say, I'm better than you or you're better than me, and look at the score. And so I can mete out love to people in accordance with how well they stack up, and that's very punishing, in fact, in practice.
Well, and one other thing you talk about is the attraction of distraction. You know, people like to be distracted, but of course the other part of that, which we've talked about on this program before, I think I even mentioned it in our little booklet on social media, is that we are starting to notice now creativity declining. I mean, there are TED Talks about this, there are books that have been written about it, and part of it is people no longer have any, if you will, think time, no downtime of their phones and their watches and everything like that just demand so much from them. And then we do have that distraction, which keeps us from maybe being focused. And so those are some really important principles that are in this book. But let's, if we can, take a break, and we'll spend some time when we come back talking about some other aspects of seculosity, because this one takes on a number of things we've already talked about, like busyness and romance and parenting and technology. But I want to get into the idea of work and leisure, that certain balance. A very interesting chapter on food and politics, and then what he calls Jesus land, and then finally what to do about this. If nothing else, it just reminds us that we do have some secular idols, and if nothing else, that's why we need to make sure that we don't make things in our world an idol. So if you would benefit from this book, as I said, it is now out, and you perhaps will find it in your local bookstore, but more likely we've made it very easy for you to order, and we have information about that on our website. When we come back, we'll also talk with David about the Mockingbird website. It's mbird.com, so you can find it there. Fascinating material so that you can find the recordings, you can find some of the social information, and a variety of other things that are relevant to that as well. And most importantly, we also want to mention just a little bit about this journal that comes out called the Mockingbird. So we have a lot to cover, and we'll do our best to try to do so right after these important messages.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dyes would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Dave is all with us as we talk about his book, Seculosity. But for just a minute, David, let's, if we can, also mention that your website is mbird.com. And so if people want to go to the Mockingbird website, and we have that link on our website, as well as other information about you as well, what will they find? Because you have a great deal of information there, and I want people to know a little bit more about the Mockingcast, the Mockingbird journal, and all sorts of other resources. So talk about what is available to some of our listeners today.
Oh, sure. Well, Mockingbird is an organization that exists to connect all sorts of happenings in everyday life with the view of reality that we as Christians embrace in the Bible. And so we're especially interested in the way that grace plays out in unexpected forms. And so some days you'll find something that's about relationships. Someday you'll find something about that we talk about, spiritual themes in a particular work of literature. Some days it'll be humor. It's always something different, but most of the ideas that I've spoken about today in seculosity and secular righteousness and these sorts of things, this is stuff that we've pioneered on that website. Just taking it as it comes daily and looking for signs of life wherever we can find them. So, there's a variety of contributors from a variety of places, but hopefully it forms a coherent whole that testifies to the goodness of God's grace and mercy.
If you'd like to know a little bit more about David's website, we have that on the website, pointofview.net. Also have a link to his Facebook page, his Twitter feed, and so all sorts of great resources there. So take the time to find that. And let's, if we can, get back to the book, Seculosity, the seculosity of work. Now, again, you could write a whole book on that subject because we've talked about workaholism and we've talked about how people get their identity through work. But take us through some of the things that you talk about here, because you talk about everything from procrastination and a variety of other topics that people might not have expected to find in that chapter.
Well, I think work, yes, it is the great barometer of American barometer of worth. And but the innovation of the last 30 some odd years, which has really increased, I think, in the last 10 or so, is to look to work not only for a paycheck or to do something valuable or contribute to society in some way, but you look to it as a primary source of community and of meaning and even salvation. That there is no distinction, in fact, for work between work and life, as they say. The old joke was that, I think as someone at Amazon once said, that work-life balance is just for people who don't like their job. And you see that with the younger generation. They're much more habituated to always working, that work and home meld into one, and maybe this strange time where lots of people are working from home has contributed to that. But yes, I've found work. I work also with undergraduates here at the university as a campus minister, and there's a lot of fear and pressure to really that there is no other metric of righteousness in a person's life other than career success, and that's just not true. So I think someone like David Brooks once said that when we tell young people to go out and follow their dreams and find the perfect career for them, that's a recipe for supreme anxiety, because it's much more as though you go out, you stumble along, and then you kind of figure out what you're good at as you go. And, those of us who believe in God, we believe that God puts opportunities in your way, and that He calls you to certain opportunities rather than this. There's being one thing that you can do. It's like the soulmate thing. There's one possible career for you, and then everything else is a waste of your time. That is no wonder people are so anxious about work.
Well, and again, if you pursue your dream, and your dream is to be a singer, we've seen a lot of them show up on American Idol that can't sing. There is, of course, so that's a problem. And then the other, back to the biblical idea of calling. I mean, if indeed God has called you into a particular ministry, it may not have been your dream, it's God's dream. It may not be that you, even as a young individual, well, maybe some of our listeners right now are trying to figure out what their dreams are. You may discover, as I have, and I think most people have, later in life, some things that you do well that you never would have thought about when you were a teenager. So there's just a lot packed into that, but we want to keep moving down the road. And so let's talk about seculosity of leisure, which, as you just pointed out, and as we've pointed out before, sometimes people have no place for it, or as you talk about here, some of it has to do with exercise, but there is a need to recognize that even if we do put leisure on a pedestal, we need to put it in its proper place. Help us out with that.
Yes, that's right. You know that I think I talk about the Ten Commandments there and the Sabbath rest, and that being a very difficult one for us as Americans, because we just are so programmed to, bootstrap and to work hard, and that's a gift we've been given, but it also can be a real liability when it comes to, loving other people. And so leisure, what I mean is that we no longer leisure is supposed to be where you enjoy God's creation, and you take a break, you rest, you do something for the sake of just doing it, not because it advances you in some way on a ladder toward achievement. So, but today, so instead of someone who enjoys jogging, you have to be training for a marathon.
Yeah.
Or if instead of you're a person who enjoys making quilts, now you have an Etsy shop, and it becomes another productivity thing. So I talk in there about sleep, even that the only way you can get Americans to buy mattresses is to tell them it'll help them work better or more efficiently, rather than they need rest. And God, what is the verse in the Psalms that God gives to His beloved rest or sleep? It's I don't think the commandment to take a Sabbath was there to remind us that we are not slaves to productivity, because they were coming out of Egypt, the Israelites were, and yet we seem to efficiency, productivity. When it takes all of our leisure pursuits captive, well, then all of a sudden they're no longer as enjoyable, and that's a sad. I think it adds to the pressure that we're talking about.
I would certainly think so. Let me get into a couple more. And again, each one of these we could spend quite a bit of time on, but the seculosity of food. Now, that's not one that if I was writing the book I would have written, but once I got into it, I said, I love this, because one of your lines is, we talk about food today the way we used to talk about sex. Last time you used the word cheat, for instance, was in reference to a broken vow or something else. Now you probably use it, I would say, I'm cheating on my diet. So it, again, is an illustration of that. And then, of course, you talk about everything from over anorexics and overeaters anonymous and all sorts of stuff. But food has become kind of a big issue here in the 21st century, hasn't it?
Yes, and partly, I'm. This is where my personal seculosity takes hold, because I love to eat and I love good food. Who doesn't? It's a great pleasure.
Yeah.
And yet, when it becomes this thing that is again a question of righteousness, and my entire identity is wrapped up in what I eat, or I believe that all of my problems will be solved if I can just eat the right thing, or not eat the wrong thing. Well, then you're getting into a place where naturally the outworking would be eating habits that are not healthy, I guess. So yes, cheating, purity. People talk a lot about the way that we used to talk about sexual purity. Now it's almost like, well, where was this sourced? Where is this coming from that I'm eating? If I can only put the right things into my body, well, then I will sort of become sanctified, or I can cleanse instead of fast. It's a very religious. And it's a treadmill, and so people, I think, get caught on it, and there's a never-ending. There's no grace. There's no enough. So again, like all of these things, food is wonderful, and I'm all in favor of eating delicious barbecue, which I had for lunch today. But I also know that it is not it's a bottomless pit.
Yes. Well, we're all about grace around here, and you certainly are at Mockingbird, so we'll give grace for barbecue. As a matter of fact, everybody around here just perked up when they heard the word barbecue, because we actually broadcast in the Texas area, although we broadcast across the country, and some of the best barbecue just down the road, so we can relate to that as well. But let's come back and get in just to a couple more. We have the seculosity of politics in Jesus land, and then what to do about it. And I hope you are enjoying this conversation, and if you find yourself saying, I'd like to get a copy of the book, we've made it possible for you to find out more. And of course, we also have a link to Mockingbird, which is mbird.com. And I think you're going to find some great material related to the subject of grace on many of the topics we're talking about here today. We'll take a break, get back to a couple more chapters before we wind it down today. And all that happens right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
David Zahl with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Seculosity, and I thought we might focus on the seculosity of politics, of course, how that is so relevant most of the time, but also not only politics as belonging and politics as meaning, but you even have a section there, signals aren't just returning, this whole idea of virtual signaling, and it just reminds us again that, sadly, if there has been an idol that has developed over time on both sides of the aisle, it is the idol of politics. And so, again, that's one of the reasons you write about it in Chapter 8.
Yes, I think politics is a very, very tempting one. People feel extremely strongly. In fact, I think there's research that's come out that people choose their churches according to the politics now, rather than their politics according to the churches. So, which is the tail that wags the dog is a very interesting and in lots of ways unfortunate scenario. But yes, political parties are enormous places where you belong. Not just that's part of the allure, that you're part of a cause and you can feel like you matter, and that you're saving the world in a lot of ways. I think politics can be very totalizing, and that's why it's tempting. It sort of claims to explain absolutely everything, and so you see these political cults almost. I talk about virtue signaling, which is one of the great. It's all tied into technology, where it's more important to be seen as a person who cares about such and such than to actually care about something. And so we really distrust, I think, a lot of what people tell us politically, because we don't know, is this something you really care about, or is it that you signaling to a tribe that you belong, or do you wish you cared about this, or are you trying to fulfill all righteousness in someone else's eyes? And I don't know who that is. Maybe it's the university professor, or maybe that's your pastor. I don't know. But it becomes a constant demonstration of ideological righteousness that can become a real grind and obscure the actual issues, which are very important. So.
Very good. And when you talk about the competing visions that you have here in the political world, that brings us to the other chapter on the competing visions of what the church is, and that's the seculosity of Jesus land, as you call it, which, again, is something to understand as well, because people in that regard say, well, no, I'm just really trying to understand what the church should be, and I'm going to make sure that the church follows biblical ideas. But sometimes we've made even our understanding and our vision of what church should be kind of an idol as well, haven't we?
I think so. I think you hear a lot of people who've been in churches where they feel like that they were on a treadmill, a different type, rather than being at a place where they encountered God and were able to worship God, that it was a place where they were competing and comparing. Maybe that's part of that's just endemic to the human condition. But I always think that church starts to look like seculosity when it, instead of becoming a place where you receive your righteousness, it becomes a place where you have to establish your righteousness. And that's a big difference, because what we believe as Christians is that, our righteousness comes from God, the blood of Christ. And we go every week to hear, to be reminded of what God has done and what God is doing, and rather than to say, hey, God, guess what? I'm God's gift to you, to God, to the church, and I am here to demonstrate my value. So it's a difference between seeing God as a father or as an employer. And so I don't think we can help but import some of the seculosity attitudes into the church. That doesn't mean that God isn't still very active and working through all sorts of means within wonderful churches in our country. But it does mean that when people say that I couldn't keep it up anymore about church, you say, well, that is – I thought church was the place you went when everything fell apart, rather than another place to try to keep up appearances.
Another treadmill. So the conclusion is what to do about it. And I love it because, I've strung you along long enough, because it isn't so much about what you do as who you are. And if nothing else, sometimes letting go of control. So talk about that, because as we wind it down, that's another part of it. And sometimes if we just think that this is just another to-do list to deal with the other to-do lists, we've sort of missed the point, haven't we?
Yes, and it maybe is a slight pulling of the rug out from under the person who's been reading. But if I've been saying that our abundance of doing and our overinflated understanding of what we can contribute has driven so much of our exhaustion and our loneliness, well then I didn't want to somehow prescribe more of that. I really believe that God rescues people. He's in the rescue business, and he rescues those who are, he saves sinners. And those are precisely the people who've fallen off the ladder, whatever, if it's the ladder of exercise or of career or whatnot. And so I try to give a few helpful, hints of what I think this could look like. But ultimately, the hope is not in a reconceived to-do list. The hope is in God, a God of grace, a religion. Our religion is not a religion of pure law and demand. It's a religion that has the law, but it also has the gospel, which is that you are absolved, that God not only cares about right and wrong, but he himself has come down to human beings to be that rightness and to rescue those in need of a Savior. So it's good news. And all of these seculosities, they're sort of all of the demanding parts of Christianity, but with none of the mercy or forgiveness. And that's what I'm trying to draw people back, or at least explain why Christianity might be not only an option, but the option for those of us who are struggling to keep it up.
Again, the book is entitled Seculosity, How Career, Parenting, Technology, Food, Politics, and Romance Become Our New Religion and What to Do About It. And we also have a link to this ministry called Mockingbird, which is a ministry that really is an attempt to try to connect our Christian faith with, kind of our everyday life, some of the things we've talked about here, and to do that maybe in a down-to-earth kind of way. And there are publications. There is, of course, a newsletter. There is, of course, a particular broadcast as well called the Mockingcast. There are conferences. You might want to actually schedule David to come and speak to your community or your church or conference. And then, of course, there are all sorts of online resources. So you can go to mbird.com and find out a little bit more. We also have next to David's picture there as well a link to his Facebook page and his Twitter feed. And so, David, thank you, first of all, for writing the book, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much, Kerby. It's been a pleasure.
We are going to take a break, but just before we do so, let me again just let you know about some of the things that we're talking about. His point is very simple, that really at the heart of where we find ourselves right now is kind of this universal yearning, and there's a desire to be happy, to be respected, to be fulfilled. That's understandable. And so what he does is help us look at some of these things that may have become idols in our lives, and to understand that we do need to be busy, we need to achieve, we need to have strong marriages and families, and we need to work and have some time for leisure and enjoy food and all the rest, but there are some limits. And so he has coined the term seculosity. I hope it takes a hold, because it's just a good way to think about this. And I thought you would really enjoy this book. And it has been out for a while, so you may be able to find it in your local bookstore. But the good news is we also have a link on our website to it, both in hardcover and in Kindle. So you can find all of that at the website pointofview.net. And of course, you'll find all sorts of other things, my viewpoints, commentary, some action items, and much more. So feel free to go to the website pointofview.net. That's all we have right now. Thank you for joining us on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.